Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really pleased that we have you joining us today for the Student Demographic Data Project, our town hall for the staff and faculty on campus. So we'll start first. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement and indicate that I want to acknowledge that the UBC Vancouver campus is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, and also acknowledge that the Silk Okanagan Nation and their peoples in whose traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory, UBC Okanagan, is situated. It is an important part of the truth and reconciliation process to acknowledge these lands and to those who are caretakers of these lands since time immemorial. Next slide, please. Today, you're going to hear from this group of folks here on this slide. I will ask them to introduce themselves as they speak. And what you have here is a group of individuals who have been sponsors for this project and also project team members. And we're delighted to have one of our advisory committee members also help us today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Kate Ross. I'm the Associate Vice President of Enrollment Services and the Registrar, and happy to get things going for us today. So the other thing I want to ask you to do is that if you have any questions, if you could actually put those in the Q&A, and you can actually upvote those questions as the session goes on. And our plan is that we will go through our presentation, and then we'll have a good amount of time for Q&A. So get your questions in there and vote them up. So in terms of why we undertook this project, I want to talk about it in relation that it's a partnership between the Equity and Inclusion Office, Enrollment Services, Planning and Institutional Research, and Enterprise Data Governance. And it was at the request of the president to encourage us to look at how we could develop, please go back, and develop demographic data collections strategy for students. Over the course of this project, though, what we really learned is student data is similar to employee data, and it's really about people. And really what I think what we're coming up with is data standards and data definitions and questions that will inform how we ask these questions for people at UBC, students, employees, faculty, and staff. And a big part of the work has been to develop clear definitions and standards for collecting these data, this individual data, and in doing so, better inform our planning, reporting, and policy making, and helping us to actually really understand distinct contexts and lived experiences of individuals to create a more inclusive and robust campus experience for all members of the UBC community. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Arig to take us to the next part of our presentation. Arig? Oh, that's supposed to be me. Just to give you a sense of how the program is organized, we have a set of project sponsors, as I indicated at the beginning. We have an advisory committee. We have many members of the UBC community who have been involved in an advisory committee. And we have a wonderful project team who has really done the substantial work and the heavy lifting to get us to where we are at this point in the project. So with that, Arig, we'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Kate. So I'm just going to speak briefly about the purpose of the data collection So the rationale for the project, the student demographic data project, stems from the recommendations that came out of a call from the BC Office of Human Rights Commission regarding legislation governing disaggregated demographic data collection, and it was in the interest of addressing systemic discrimination. Paul will touch on that legislation a little bit later as well, but it is in the spirit of this call that we are, at least one of the reasons for pursuing this is being aligned with that call. The lead recommendation that came from a report that was called the Grandmother Perspective Report said, quote, collect data in service of systemic equity with the meaningful involvement of equity deserving and underrepresented communities. And I think later you'll hear about the efforts that were undertaken to make sure that this was a fulsome consultation with communities. So disaggregated data means data that's been broken down by detailed subcategories across social identity groupings, like gender, racial identity, sexual orientation, region, level of education, for example. And the reason it's important to collect disaggregated data as a best practice is that granularity of data allows us to reveal any kind of disadvantage or inequities that may be hidden when we are looking at aggregate data. Lastly, we're not the only institution doing this work across higher education. This is again a best practice that a lot of institutions are now undertaking, and so we're very excited to be able to actually implement this kind of a project in order to have stay true to our promise for evidence-based decision making in our planning and implementation. So over to the next person. I'm not sure whose slide this is.
It's me, Arig, Stephanie.
Okay, all right, Stephanie.
Hi, everybody. I'm Stephanie McKeown. I'm the Chief Institutional Research Officer at UBC and have been working on this project as a sponsor and part of the project working group. So I'm going to talk about the project kind of outline, so the overview of the project and what we have done over the last year and a bit. The project includes 4 streams, which are interrelated but also distinct. So sometimes they were going kind of together, and other times we were working on one and then waiting for the next to take place. First was the development of the demographic questions, working with students to understand how they want to self-identify. We wanted to understand how students interpret these questions, how they engage with the questions, and take that into consideration during the development and further refinement of the demographic question. So we held 2 rounds of focus groups with students starting in October 2021 and ending in March 2022. A total of 289 students participated in 37 focus group sessions, both graduate and undergraduate, from both Okanagan and Vancouver campuses. The first round of focus group sessions were to find out from students how we should be asking questions related to affordability, religion, race and ethnicity, and disability. Our second round of focus groups further explored some of these same questions after student feedback and making sure that they could see themselves in the questions that we refined, as well as how do we report out on these questions. And then also we added some information around socioeconomic status and also introduced them with a standard that came from the ministry with gender identity. The next stream is the discovery stream to assess who within our UBC community were already collecting demographic data across the university. When are they collecting this information? How and for what purposes are these data being collected? So we sent out a Qualtrics survey to faculty members and administrators, and a link was also active on the Equity and Inclusion's office's website to complete the survey and provide us with information about what kinds of demographic data collection were they participating in. We had 172 responses to the survey, And the information that contained within the survey helped us to better understand what information was needed in the community. The third stream examined the technical requirements needed to collect these data centrally, particularly in our administrative systems, and requirements needed for implementation across the university with multiple systems. So as you know, we are currently in between student information systems. And so the end goal would be to have this information contained in Workday Student or somehow connected to Workday, similarly to how the staff and faculty employment equity survey are collected. But we do need to wait for Workday Student to go live. And so we've put forward a recommendation to collect this information in the interim centrally through a survey, and Annie will talk about that in a little bit. Finally, communicating about demographic data collection to our students, staff, and faculty is critical. Our community needs to understand how we're approaching demographic data collection and why we're collecting this information. Also, we want to manage expectations about who will be able to access these data and for what purposes, and how we'll be able to access this information. We've engaged with our sponsors, advisory committee members, key knowledge holders on these topics within our community, as well as speaking with some members of the province on some of the work that they're doing as well. This is our second town hall this week, and we will continue to be updating our website located on the Equity and Inclusion Office's website. So please go to that site for more information, and we'll be sharing that a little bit later and also in the chat. I'm going to pass it over now to Annie.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. Hi, everyone. My name is Annie Yim, and I'm the Deputy Registrar Enrollment Services for the Vancouver campus, and I also serve as a project lead. So currently at UBC, student demographic data, it's collected at an institutional level through our centralized student information system and through our student surveys, such as New to UBC and the Undergraduate Experience Survey. Through the data discovery stream of our work, we learned that there's also other decentralized data collection processes taking place across various units at UBC. So this has resulted in student demographic data currently being asked and collected in different variations. Next slide, please. So to enable consistency in what is being asked and the available response variables, the project has defined the following demographic data to be in scope, which ultimately will lead to approved definitions and standards that will become part of the UBC data governance program. I just want to note that the establishment of questions and responses for some of these demographic data will have undergone a slightly different process. So for example, with gender, the BC Ministry of Advanced Education released the Gender Identity and Sex Information Data Standard and Guidelines to assist all BC Public Service employees in the collection of these data. And we've adopted this standard with the intention of suggesting some minor changes. With respect to Indigenous self-identification, we're waiting for guidance on these data from the ministry as well as our Indigenous community leaders. So this guidance will also be informed by the anti-racism legislation. And we're hoping that we'll be able to hear back and have some more clear direction on this piece, hopefully sometime within the end of this year. Next slide, please. So in our efforts to collect these demographic data, we're looking to take a holistic person approach. And this is in recognition that an individual at UBC can have one or more affiliations at any given time. So you can be both a student and a student employee at one time. So in taking a holistic person approach, we want to ensure there's consistency on how we collect demographic data for individuals at UBC, and very importantly, that there's a single source of truth for an individual's demographic data, which is really critical in ensuring the consistency and accuracy of these data. And then the other note that I'll point out is the collection and maintenance of these data need to be timely and responsive to the fact that an individual may and most likely will evolve in terms of how they identify. So really, we want to ensure that individuals have the ability to update and change their submitted demographic information at any point in time. So with that, I'll turn it now over to Elsie to talk a little bit more about the process the project undertook to get to where we're at.
Thanks, Annie. Hello, everyone. My name is Elsie Achubwe. I am Director of Institutional Initiatives in the Equity and Inclusion Office, and have also been serving as a project lead. So just to further frame and contextualize the conversation for today, and we wanted to review, again, the project processes to date and how we got here. And some of this Stephanie has spoken to in describing the 4 streams of the project. And the key points to take away are really to understand that this has been an evolving and iterative and rigorous undertaking, informed by a suite of both progressive and parallel activities, all which have informed the proposed principles, definitions, and standards that the project is putting forward. So the project began with a review of past institutional surveys at UBC, in addition to a comprehensive literature review and comparative review of current ministry guidelines and industry and government standards where those were available. As Stephanie alluded to, 2 rounds of focus groups were conducted, engaging nearly 300 students, graduate and undergraduate, at both campuses. The first was held last fall, beginning in October, and that second round held in the spring of this year, wrapping up in March. The draft questions were piloted at 2 stages and quantitative analysis conducted, both in the undergraduate experience survey, January, the start of this year, and in the new to UBC survey this summer. The discovery survey that Stephanie mentioned earlier was launched in the spring, again, aiming to better understand the broader data landscape at UBC, particularly as it relates to equity, diversity, and inclusion, and current data collection and management practices underway. All the while, the project team has consulted and solicited comments and feedback from the advisory committee, the project sponsors, and other stakeholders across the university. It's important for us to really reiterate that throughout this effort, the project team has aimed to prioritize and elevate students' voices and perspectives. We're really aiming to ensure that students understand what is being asked of them and why, and that they see themselves in the language, terminology, and concepts that we're using. This is key to ensuring that they're comfortable in self-identifying, and ultimately will impact participation and response rates going forward, which of course has implications for the overall quality of this data. And I'll hand it over to Negar to tell us a bit more about students' perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you, Elsie. So my name is Negar. I am one of the senior research analysts that worked with the student groups and the focus groups. And so I want to speak a little bit about why we think it's important that students self-identify and that their voice was included in these focus groups and how we proceeded in the project. So first off, self-identifying and provides more inclusive and demographically representative information. Something that was very important to students was inclusion and feeling seen and represented in the questions, and that also related to whether they would be more likely to answer a question. These levels of disaggregated data will better inform UBC's policies, planning, reporting, the initiatives, because it provides that distinct context and lived experience from the students themselves. That would, of course, contribute to a more inclusive and robust campus for every student, especially when they feel that they are being represented. And lastly, it provides a clear picture on where to focus that equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts in those initiatives we've been working on. And of course, it provides evidence and the rationale we need to address any disadvantages or discrimination faced by members in equity deserving groups. So in the next slide, I can talk a little bit more about what those focus groups look like and what the students' voice were. So we used the 4 R's approach. The 4 R's was a holistic Indigenous framework that was presented in the grandmother's perspective that I think Stephanie touched on. So we used this approach throughout the project, and we tried to use it to guide us through the whole project. And it actually very organically came up in our data as well. So one of the ways this happened is if I were to distill our data from the student focus groups into 3 themes, which would be making it very simple, but it would be that students cared about transparency, they cared about reciprocity, and they cared about inclusion. And so you can see in this adapted diagram, we tried to give you a visual of what those interconnections were like for a student experience at UBC. So for example, when it came to transparency, students wanted to know where the data was going, who was going to govern this data, how it would be used, how it was going to be connected to them, who would take on the responsibility of making sure that data stays safe, secure. And they wanted to feel like they were a part of that process and knowing where all of this was going. It wasn't that they answered a question and it just disappears into the ether. Another theme, the reciprocity, was a big one, because when we talked about why students might choose to disclose or not disclose certain questions or certain data, they spoke about how they would be more likely to disclose if they knew that there would be some kind of reciprocity from the university. If they were to disclose that they needed financial help, that they would somehow get more resources around that. If they were to disclose that they had disabilities, that they would get more resources or support. And even if they themselves didn't require those supports, they were more likely to answer the questions if they knew other students would get support. And of course, when we were talking about respect, relevance, and responsibility, it also was all interconnected in some of the things that we learned from them. For example, a lot of our questions did not include "I choose not to disclose," and students felt that was important and different from just replying no or just skipping the question as well, to kind of show you that they were not comfortable with the question or that they didn't want that data to be represented. They don't want to be asked again, for example. They chose not to disclose the first time. And that kind of related to the relevance as well, because with the amount of surveys and information that they're always being bombarded with, they wanted to know that they weren't just answering questions for the sake of answering them, and that there were purpose and meaning behind each one of them. And that we would respect their time and their efforts in doing that. This also meant we worked a lot on our preambles together. It's not something we're ready to share just yet, but we did speak to students about what it meant when we meant confidential versus anonymous, what it meant when we meant that they would be connected to student records, things like that. And overall, we just found that framework actually organically came up throughout our project as well. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Paul Hancock, and I am the legal counsel, information and privacy for the university, working out of the office of the University Counsel. And I've been providing privacy advice to the project throughout. And what I'd like to talk to you about today is just briefly outline the privacy and confidentiality issues around demographic data from a legal perspective. And so on the first slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about the legal framework. And then on the second slide, I'm going to apply that legal framework to demographic data. So let's get started. So the first question everyone will have is, what is privacy? There are different definitions, but under the legislation, which is called the BC Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, or FIPPA, it has a very specific meaning, which is that it's the rules around the collection, use, and disclosure of personal information. And so that raises the next question, which is, well, what's personal information? And that is defined as recorded information about an identifiable individual. So any information about an individual where you know who they are, that's personal information. And there are a lot of very significant rules about what we can do with that information. And those rules include rules around collection, use, retention, how long we can keep the information, disclosure, and protection of the information. What do we have to do to make sure that it is secure? Often the questions that I get revolve around disclosure, which is another way of saying, you know, when is the information confidential? And so one really important thing to keep in mind is that misuse of personal information has serious consequences. This is our guiding star, is always to keep in mind what those consequences may be. And the first and most important one of those is that disclosure of personal information could have harm to individuals. This is not just a legal discussion here. This is a practical and ethical discussion about collecting and using information which is sensitive. And the disclosure of personal information can potentially have harm to individuals in terms of embarrassment, humiliation, or even physical harm in some cases. And that is the case in this project. We're talking about very sensitive information. And, regardless of any legal liability, the most important thing we need to think about is the ethical aspects of this and the importance of doing this the right way to maintain the security of the information and to use it appropriately. There are obviously other implications of the disclosure of, or misuse rather, of personal information. We could be subject to fines of up to $500,000 from the Privacy Commissioner. We could be the target of lawsuits under the Privacy Act. And there could also be discrimination or human rights complaints against the university as well, especially when we're talking about demographic data. So, we have to keep all of those things in mind as we move forward. Next slide, please. So let's apply some of those principles to demographic data. First thing to keep in mind is that demographic data about identifiable individuals is personal information of a very sensitive kind. I mean, that's maybe a statement of the obvious, but it's worth saying. And so the question is, first of all, are we allowed to collect this data at all? And, we do not have the right to, we do not have an unrestricted right to collect this kind of personal information. But FIPA does allow us to collect it if it is necessary, important word, for the purpose of operating, planning, or evaluating a UBC program or activity. So in short, the principle is need to know, not nice to know. It's not enough that we think it might be nice to have. We should need to have it. There's another piece of legislation that Arig had mentioned, and that's the BC Anti-Racism Data Act, which was recently passed by the BC legislature. And that allows the government to collect demographic data for various purposes. It does not apply for some reason to post-secondary bodies and other local bodies like UBC, but we act in the spirit of this legislation as well. So we have sort of the same purpose when we collect the data as the province does when it collects that data. All right, so now let's get to some specific questions. Can we use demographic data for statistical reasons or for process improvement to improve, the way that the university runs its systems and operates its programs? And the answer is yes. That's the normal reason, or one of the main reasons, I should say, for collecting demographic data. We do need to be cautious that using it is one thing, but the reporting of that type of data should only be done in aggregated form. So, for example, if we prepared a report showing, incidents of people in a certain faculty with a certain demographic background, certainly we can do that, but we would not want to report it in such a way that you could identify those individuals, because that would be personal information. You're not allowed to disclose that. So it would have to be at an aggregated form when we report it to the public. The other way that demographic data can be used, and we're often asked about this as well, is to make individual decisions about the people that we're talking about. So that could be about admissions, awards, hiring, or other things. And the use of data for that purpose, demographic data, is more restricted. We can sometimes use it for those purposes, but the Human Rights Code does restrict when we're allowed to use demographic data to make decisions about people. If we are, hiring or people or admitting them to certain programs or promoting them or giving them some other kind of benefit based on demographic data, we can do that under some circumstances, but that has to be approved under the Human Rights Code. And I won't get into that because of the time, but there is a process for us to review that. So that it's not open season to make those kinds of decisions. Okay. So given that that's the case, those are the two potential uses, but there are some restrictions. The really important question is, how do we collect and disclose the demographic data? The safest method to collect demographic data to ensure that it is used and disclosed appropriately is to collect it in a centralized manner rather than a decentralized manner. What do I mean by that? I mean that if every department or unit is collecting the data on its own, not only is that inefficient and maybe inconsistent and so on and so forth, but that may also involve mistakes in the way that the data is used, and misuse of the data, and maybe disclosure of personal information when it's not appropriate. So collecting it in a centralized manner where it's safe is the preferred model. And in terms of disclosure, if there are requests for access for the data from units for whatever purpose there may be, there is a process for access to data already. It's called the data access request process. And that's the process that would be appropriate for this type of very sensitive personal information. So we're not inventing a new process, but there's already one in place where, for example, a unit could request demographic data about its own students for some sort of process improvement research project, for example. So that would be the preferred process for collecting, storing, and making demographic data available. So I think I've spoken enough. I've covered the main points. Glad to answer any more questions if you have any during the question and answer session. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paul. And just as a reminder, I'm going to just have 2 slides here, and we'll be going into Q&A. So if you have any questions, please enter them into the Q&A and vote up your questions. So the other thing that we wanted to talk about is really the importance of having data governance and data standards. And there's been a significant initiative over a number of years now to actually do a much better job of this at UBC. And there are many reasons why we want to do this. And it really helps us guide the collection of data. It gives us standards to work with. It ensures that our data is accurate and consistent, and can help us, in terms of avoiding ambiguity and minimize redundant data. And it really will help us gain greater intelligence because we actually have standards to work with. And that's really a big component of this work, is to actually have these data standards and definitions and questions that can be utilized for the collection of these data. Next slide, please. So where to from here? We're hoping that we will finish up the recommendations by December 2022, so not too far from now, and that those would then be utilized so that we could actually launch a full data equity survey in fall of 2023. And this would be first iteration of a survey such as this. The plan would be to use Canvas and a Qualtrics survey, because of course we have an interim period where we can't be collecting these data through something like Workday. And the plan would be then to move to a university-wide implementation in 25-26, where students we'd have a centralized method for doing this, and hopefully where people can actually go in and view and change any of these data standards or elements as something for them in terms of their identity changes. Some of this will be available right out of the box when Workday goes live in the spring of 2024. We know that some of that will be available and others will need to come online over time. So with that, that's our update for you, and we're really happy to go to questions. So please enter your questions in the Q&A. Did we have any pre-questions?
No, we didn't.
Okay, thanks, Shao. Negar, thank you for putting up the data standards. Yes, I'm seeing we might have one question. Have we considered a retention policy for these data? Who would like to answer that? We have retention policies already, right? Paul, do you want to answer that?
Sure, I can take a stab at it, but Barbara would know better than I about the retention policies. So all I can say is that, you know, we have looked, I don't have them in front of me, but we have looked at the retention schedules, and we believe that the data that we are collecting falls under some of the definitions under those the policies, the retention schedules, specifically around student information. So we'll be following those retention periods, but I can't remember offhand what they are. I'd have to look that up.
Negar, did you want to say anything further, or are you okay? Perfect.
I have someone here with a raised hand, and we need to help them unmute. So I'll unmute Anis Hong. Go ahead with your question.
Oh, sorry about that, Negar. I think I had hit the unmute accidentally.
Okay, so we do have another question. I'll read it, and then maybe somebody will be able to answer it. If students are also employees, would they fill out the student survey and then not do the employee equity survey? Relatedly, what are the connections between this project and the data collected from employees through the employment equity survey? So let's answer that first question first, and then we can go maybe to the second one. Who would like to answer that?
Well, I'm wondering, Elsie, did you want to take a stab at that?
I could take a stab unless you already had an answer. Well, it's a scenario we haven't been faced with yet, right? For not having had a centralized student survey. So presently, yeah, students who are employees that meet the eligibility criteria for reporting under the Employment Equity Survey, they have been captured and reported in that cohort of the UBC workforce, of faculty and staff. So in this scenario where students may actually be prompted then to complete the student survey and the employment equity survey, I think it would depend on the timing. Some of that is questions we have, I think, still to think through in terms of the implementation process. Right now, with the Employment Equity Survey, because of how it's structured, and an employee can encounter the survey more than one time, the default practice to date is to use the most recent response submitted. So that might be one consideration we could take into account if someone is in the position of having responded to both surveys. I think the second question talks about the the relation between the two. And that is one piece that this project has been considering, is ensuring that the standards put forward for students is translatable and relatable to the same set of information that we're collecting for faculty and staff. So there was a slide Annie spoke to about this approach of the holistic approach, recognizing that someone can be various roles, right? Student or staff throughout the relationship with UBC. I'll open it up to others if they have additional information they would share.
Anybody want to add anything? I think that's one of the reasons why, you know, there's this realization, and it is one of the benefits of Workday is that there's a people object, and the people can have multiple identities, and part of that is both employee and student, that's a really important consideration in terms of this work. So I know the team's really been working to think that through. Thank you for the question, Christina.
If I can maybe just add one more thing, Kate, just the other, I guess, component to this is really the technical aspect and being able to enable that connectivity that Christina was asking about. And while our desire and our intention is to have that holistic approach, to be able to enable it to be seamless in the way that I think we would all envision, it's going to take a bit of time, I think, from a technical perspective to be able to enable it. But certainly, I think it's an excellent question, and the project has certainly been thinking about it in that way. But you may not see it be enabled as seamlessly as one would think, just because of those technical pieces, and we are committed to sort of figuring that out as time goes on. But I thought that might be just helpful to illuminate.
Yeah, that's a great point, Annie. It will take time, just as it's taken time to be thoughtful. This is difficult work, right? And so it's taken time to actually really work through the challenges. Just getting input and ensuring that we're hearing the voices, and that is reflected in how we think about asking students for this information, and employees and staff, right, and faculty. We have to be thoughtful about it. Any other questions that people have? Okay, I'm not seeing any. We really want to thank you very, very much for your participation today. We have a way for you to connect with the project. We have some contact information here through student.demographic@ubc.ca. And also a couple of links for you in terms of more information about this project, which is housed on the Equity Inclusion site, and also information about data governance standards for you. So we hope that you find that helpful. And please feel free to reach out to members of this panel today if you have any further questions or thoughts for us. And thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.